Welcome, everyone, to our first session of the Guilt-Free Book Club, Fall 2023. I'm really delighted to be here with you and discuss Learning That Matters, a field guide to course design for transformative education, which was the winner of the Society of the Professors of Education Book Award in 2022. And I can see why, because my ed school heart was shining when reading this book. It is fabulous and full of gems and jewels, and just I think does a great job of coalescing all what we know about teaching and learning and best practices and kind of the zeitgeist of this moment into a book with a lot of both theory but a lot of practice, practical application, and also personal reflection and questions for reflection that are very rich and I think really exciting to discuss with all of you. So I'll just go around and give everyone a chance to introduce themselves. My name is Josh Luckins. I work as an instructional designer at the Wentworth Institute of Technology here in the Teaching and Learning Collaborative. And I've been running the Guilt-Free Book Club for the past couple of years and had a wonderful opportunity to read all sorts of amazing books related to teaching and learning in higher ed. And looking forward to discussing this one with you, not only this semester, but we're going to actually continue this book through the spring semester too, because the chapters are just so rich. We wanted to give folks the opportunity to dive into it a little bit more deeply. So I'll turn things over to Misty, who's to my left on my Zoom screen.
Hi, everyone. I am the Associate Director of the Digital Learning Environment at Wentworth, and I also work with Josh in TLC. So we are colleagues, and this is my first book club, so I'm excited to be here.
Thanks for being here. Susanna?
Hi, Susanna Gao, Professor of Biology, but also the Associate Dean in the School of Sciences and Humanities. And because this is guilt-free, I'm going to say I haven't read it. So
No worries. I'm so glad that you're still here. I'm really grateful for you for being here, and it's totally fine. Lorenz.
Hi everyone, my name is Lawrence Marcellus. I am one of the advisors for the School of Engineering, like I said earlier. I started around like January, so I'm kind of new to Wentworth. And I think the school, the office was open, TSO office was open. I stopped by and asked. That's how I found out about the book club. So here I am.
So I'm so glad that you're with us, and I look forward to getting to know you more in person. I'll definitely be seeing you around in BD's third floor. If you got a chance to open up the document, you'll see that there's a lot of quotes already there, and there's a bit of structure. Before I open up into kind of like some things that I planned, I just want to give, if anyone does have anything they want to share, just off the bat of any reflections, if you were able to take a look at the book, or even just from the title of the book itself, anything that you'd like to say about your feelings on it so far.
I'm curious what people think learning that matters. How can you tell when it matters, and to whom does it matter? Maybe it would be a good start as a discussion. So I can imagine it matters to the students, but how does it matter to the faculty members? That kind of thing.
Really good question. Excellent. What else? What else do folks think right off the bat?
And how would you measure it even? Assessment is one of the things that, I'm interested in, have done. How could you tell whether it matters or there's learning, so.
Such good questions. And actually, definitely come back to our last meeting of this semester. The chapter is called Connected Assessment. So it deals very directly with assessment. And we're actually going to have a guest at that meeting who's our Betsy Krantz, who's our new director of assessment here at Wentworth. So we're excited to dive more into that. But such great questions already from the get-go. Misty, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, I am interested in the and I haven't read the book either yet, but I do I have been doing a lot of research on equity in education, so I'm really interested to hear what they have to say. But I like that they're anchoring it in a constructivist theory, because I do think that is one way to promote equity, but also learning and positive outcomes. So I'm excited to see that those things are there. And I'm hoping that, this idea of transformative is something that we can maybe carry through in our own instruction and transform the way people are teaching and approaching teaching with some of these kinds of frameworks in mind.
So just from my understanding, what is constructivist and what are the other options?
Well, there's many options, but they don't necessarily have to be separate. They could be all integrated together. But constructivist, and Josh, you can jump in, is when it's a way of, think of the root word, constructing knowledge. So it's not that I can just disseminate and give you knowledge, but you are working to construct your own mental models and so on, and how you learn. And some of that can be social construction, right? So working together to think about it. And that way, learners can have greater gains than if they're just given the knowledge directly or even working on their own, but being able to give learners a little bit of help and helping them construct those models, mental models for themselves. So that reflection, all kinds of things that can happen. But Josh, you want to fill in some gaps?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So yeah, let's go back to ed school. This is really exciting. So all right. So there's all sorts of different researchers who have come up with different theories of how humans learn things and how humans learn things best, and then have tested those theories in all sorts of different ways, experiments, studies, etc. And this book kind of distills a lot of research from the past century into two particular theories that they focus on most deeply, that they say through their analysis of all the research that is their most effective strategies for deep and meaningful learning or transformational learning. And we'll see what they mean by that later. And they talk about constructivism and social constructivism kind of in the same breath, kind of as two parts of one whole, and connectivism. And so if we look a little more at the document, and I can share it actually, just so we can all be seeing it, and folks who are watching this recording later can see it. I'll just share that screen. So let's look at this. So this quote talks about how constructivist and social constructivist approaches are too slowly but replacing the outdated model of one smart teacher dispensing knowledge from the front of the classroom, or two, actually, sorry, I dictated all of these, to students of similar ages and backgrounds listening passively in quiet rows. Although seemingly efficient, linear frameworks for teaching and learning begin to break down because they don't take into account learning differences, varying learning contexts, and the role of human interaction. So if you've ever heard
And these are from the book, just to clarify, these are quotes from the book on page, in this particular page 20 to 21.
20 to 21, you got it. It says favorite quotes. So if you can imagine that there used to be this analogy of learning as a thing where there was this empty vessel, and then professors or experts had knowledge, and it was like water, and they were going to pour their knowledge into this empty vessel. And that's kind of how that was thought about. I mean, this industrial model of students in rows, and there's this deliverer of content, and that's great to have that works. Great. So then there's all these researchers who start to poke holes in that, and they're like, wait, the more we study this and study the actual outcomes of students, how much are they retaining? How much are they learning? It turns out that that's not really how learning works. We read one of our last books was called How Learning Works, and that's not it. And so there's this new idea that comes around. They're like, well, if that's not how learning works, then what is going on in the minds of learners as they learn new things? So let's look at a different quote to get a look at what they have to say about that. So we're going to anchor concept 2, construct and connect. And so they say that learners are not passive receptors. They're not kind of empty vessels waiting to be filled. Learners come in, with existing knowledge and ways of knowing. The way we learn new things is by building on what we already know, and by actively forming new connections, often by engaging with others. So this whole idea of everyone has held knowledge, and held, ways of worldviews, ways of seeing the world, ways of understanding. And then the way we actually build new understanding is on that basis, is building on what we already know, making connections on what we already know. And so then every learner is going to actually be going through a different and distinct and unique process in their own mind, in their own experience. And the process they're going to be going through is actively constructing, building new understanding on top of what they already know, connected to what they already know, branching out from what they already know. And oftentimes this happens most effectively by engaging with others. That's where the social aspect of constructivism comes in. So that's constructivism in a nutshell, this idea that that model of the empty vessel being filled doesn't work, that there's cracks in the vessel for all sorts of reasons, the water doesn't stick. So what actually works is something that's built slowly, little by little, from the ground up, outward and outward, and each learner does it in their own mind, in their own way, in their own time, in their own process. And what a teacher ideally is doing is creating a fertile and rich environment for students to do that building and do that building of new understanding by having opportunities to try things, fail, receive feedback, try again, and engaging with all these other things that other anchor concepts in the book, like equity and motivation, etc. So question.
When you're ready to take another breath, go ahead. I was just going to
go on to connectivism, which is this quote. But what were you going to say, Susanna?
The other thing that happens in science, and I've heard one of the science educators that I used to work with at another institution, the misconceptions that students have on particular topics is part of the thing you need to sort of figure out how to displace in their quote empty vessel, because if they have that misconception, and probably this fits other fields as well, but it was really obvious in certain areas of science, if you don't address those misconceptions, they can't put something else correct or appropriate in its place. And so you have to figure out what the misconceptions are and help to reorient or help the students to see it. And I didn't see that particular sort of concept reflected, but I think it's an enlargement of that concept, that they may be filled with ideas, but some of them are actually incorrect. And for science or math or some of the quantitative kinds of things, that can be very detrimental, because they pile on incorrect things onto incorrect things, and they can't figure out why it doesn't work or something, right?
Yeah, I remember talking with a lot of the physics and chem professors, especially, that a lot of the knowledge they're building in those disciplines is not necessarily intuitive to, a human being. It's these, ideas that kind of spin the world around, have you seen in a new way? So the question is, how do you get to see the world in a new way? And usually the way you come around to seeing something in a new way and changing your vantage point is not because someone tells you. It's because you have direct experience that makes you shift your perception. And that's what they're talking about when they talk about transformational education, what they mean by that. So I'll just come back to that, their definition of what they mean by transformational learning. And they call it a quality of learning in which a student encounters an idea, a theory, or evidence that changes their perspective. And they would say the testament of transformation is that it changes the self and the identity in some way. It doesn't have to be, a crazy, huge thing, but in some ways, the student leaves the learning experience different from how they came in a, measurable, as you said, way, that the student could ideally themselves discern and express metacognitively. So before we move on, I just want to show you this. So constructivism is really old. Constructivism goes back to the 70s, and it's been built upon by all sorts of theorists and researchers for a really long time. This connectivism is a bit newer of a theory, and there's aspects of it that the authors really love, and there's aspects of it that they're not as fans of, they're not going to address in this book. But the kind of key takeaways of connectivism they want to bring in are that the capacity to know is more critical than what is currently known. So basically, this idea that a 21st century skill is the ability to learn, to learn new things, and rather than you leave college knowing everything you're going to need to know for the future. Thanks for helping fix that. And nurturing and maintaining connections is needed to facilitate continual learning. So there's a lot of brain-based learning research about, looking at the actual what's happening when you learn something new, and there's new neural connections forming, or more rich pathways within the brain. And when you have a deeper understanding, you can actually see that happen in the brain, and you can be doing things in the classroom or have students doing things to build those. And passive learning is not the thing that's gonna get you there. So
And what do you
yeah.
think they meant by maintaining connections?
That's a really good question. What do you think it means? Or what does anyone else think it means? Maintaining connections. What could that mean?
Because they use that in the social constructivists, making connections, but maintaining them implies something else, to me, at least.
For sure.
For me, I think maintaining the connection is obviously you stopping the model of just the students coming in just learning what the professor just said. It's about whatever the students had before plus what they learn, have those two to come together. That's, in my head, I think that's what it means by maintaining the connection. Um, Whatever the professor was teaching plus what they already know, trying to create something new. So that's kind of my
And so,
mindset was about
right.
that.
And so you're seeing it, Lorenz, as a person to person connection or a person to a thing connection. Is that what you mean?
Could be
Or a
both.
concept? Okay.
A person to concept, a person to the faculty as well. Could be both.
So the other way I think of it, but maybe being the biologist that I am, is the neurons in there. So the way we learn is by, neural connections. And if you have one path of neurons that you keep using, they becomes, quote, a rut. And if you don't have new neurons or new ways to remake those connections that can continue to fire the same pathway. So maybe there are other kinds of actual brain connections that could be rewired in a sense that could maintain it. And that's where I think it could also be implied. And maybe that's not what they're thinking, but to me, I think that's the cool thing about the biology of learning, that it actually is, it's related to physical connections between different parts of the brain.
Totally. Hi, Betsy. Welcome. And thanks so
Hello.
much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm interested to see how this works out.
Well, it's just us having a conversation about teaching and learning, and you're right on time. So, looking forward to having your perspective. We've been talking about the theories of learning, constructivism and connectivism. And there is an interesting quote in the book where the authors repeatedly use the phrase kind of like connections matter, keep your connections up. And we're like, what does that mean? Does that mean social connections that you're learning with other people? Does that mean you're building new neural networks in your brain by seeing things from a new vantage point? Does that mean you're doing kind of retrieval practice thing and keeping things knowledge fresh, or else you're gonna, forget it? Well, what could that possibly mean? And so I just want to metacognitively take a second and reflect and say that this conversation we're having is an example of social constructivism, because we're collaboratively co-constructing meaning. We took this phrase, which we see as ambiguous, and we're like, well, it could mean this, well, it could mean that. Lorenz thinks it means this from, and you brought in that, Lorenz, the perspective as a tutor. When you're a tutor, you don't just want to tell the student the answer. You want to kind of give them enough clues so they can figure it out themselves, and they have that aha moment. And that's the idea of constructivism. They're building their own knowledge in their own brain. If you just gave it to them, you'd be like giving them a fish rather than teaching them how to fish, So we're already doing the thing where, this is nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. It's just that researchers have like identified it and given it a name and been like, this is great. This really works. We see that this works. And, why don't we do more of that in our classrooms? How could we bring more of that in? So,
And the other thing, one
yeah.
of the ways that I try and do it in my class is I like analogies, for science and a lot of subjects that works. And at one point I had the students create their own analogies. So they worked on, within their group, and then they shared them and we debriefed and so that was one way that I try and help them construct, I guess, connections that I may or may not have, thought of that
Yeah.
and that speak to them, I think, also, right?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of analogies. I talk in analogies all the time, and it's probably that instinctual need to help connections happen for, because my background is mathematics teaching, and I've often had to play with different strategies to help make connections for the students. I use analogies just like you, Susanna. I love that. I also try to dig back when I start new topics. I always try to dig back to something I know everyone in the room has mastered. Like let's start, instead of starting at the beginning of this topic, let's start with something that's familiar so that you all have both feet on solid ground and build from there. That scaffolding effect helps them make those connections to something. They're not floating. They often feel like they're floating in new space, but if you can ground them on something that's comfortable and familiar, it helps them kind of build that scaffold and make those connections.
Oh, Betsy, you brought in a great vocabulary word, which is scaffolding, educational scaffolding. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that means to you?
It's kind of like constructing knowledge. When you are learning as a lifelong learner, or as a kind of a learner who is still in that formal education process, the way we construct knowledge is the same way we construct buildings. It's the same way we construct a house. You need a solid foundation, and you need to build from the ground up. And if you try to build something on a sketchy foundation, things are going to fall apart eventually. It's like an eggshell, and it will crack. So that scaffolding process is, if you look at what scaffolding actually looks like, it's all about those connections of those different structural pieces that give it stability as you're climbing higher, or you're constructing that framework of understanding bigger and higher and better.
Nice. Great definition. So, Susanna, I'm sure you've heard of educational scaffolding before this conversation. So that concept literally comes from the research into constructivism, because they're saying, okay, if it's not empty vessel, then what is it? Oh, they're building from the bottom up. Oh, so it's a scaffold. So then there's this theoretical concept of scaffolding, and then it becomes practically applied by saying, oh, we're going to give the students an educational scaffold in this course by giving them this sheet that they're going to work, whatever the thing might be. So all of it ties in. And I just want you to know that this example that you gave just now, of you were like, okay, I'm going to provide you with a couple of analogies so you can get a sense of, how this biological process works. And now I'm going to put you in small groups, and you're going to come up with your own analogies to describe the same thing. And then we're going to share out, and, maybe you're going to draw on the board, maybe you're going to express it however you're going to express it. So you're already using a classic constructivist teaching strategy, social constructivist, because you're saying, okay, here's a way of, I'm going to give you a scaffold, which is this analogy, an example of what, a way of a new way of understanding, a new language for understanding this concept, which is this metaphor. And then I'm going to have you then take that thing that now I've given you kind of a sample of what I want you to do, and I want you to make it your own. I want you to go and build some new knowledge, not just yourself, but with these other folks, bouncing some ideas around with them. And then we're going to have all these different groups sharing out their examples. All of a sudden, there's all these new ways of seeing, looking. And a key way that that this is working is that you are learning as well as the students. It's not just I came into class and did a monologue. I came into class and got a brilliant new analogy that I'm going to use in the next section, because it's way better than the analogy I came up with, because the students are brilliant and they came up with it themselves, and everyone's co-constructing knowledge. So the idea of knowledge as a co-constructed entity, rather than something that is just unidirectional, teacher to student, is core to this. What's that?
And in a sense, it's also scaffolding, if I understand, because you're going from one analogy to another analogy, right? In that sense. And just one more minute, the other way, and I think, Josh, I told you, in my writing lab report kind of classes, I have them scaffold that lab report. So the first assignment, they're only doing, one or two parts of the thing. Then they, build on from there. So it scaffolds onto a basis, and I'm, eventually you get to the whole report, and I try and give them feedback. But that's the other way I scaffold, not just on, different analogies or information, but also assignments, building them into pieces. So
that's also a great way of assuring student success. You give them manageable amounts of information, and
with
then
feedback.
With feedback, and then you can go into the next realm and say, so we know how to do this, and that's that solid ground.
They've got to read that. That's the one thing I learned. They have to read the feedback. They don't always. So, but
No,
anyway, I've given it to them.
I had a faculty member in my past world. He was an applied mathematics instructor, and he found that no one was reading his feedback in Blackboard. And so he started doing video and audio overlay feedback on all of his assignments. And he saw a huge uptick in the student response to the feedback. It was a really cool, like I could go in and he shared.
Yeah, I think that's an option in Brightspace. I think I saw it. Okay.
You can like videotape, like you can highlight and they can watch the video and listen to, on this section, I would have liked to have seen you take these steps rather than this step. And he can kind of talk them through it. And it was pretty awesome. I was very impressed.
Next iteration.
Definitely. Yeah, that is the video and audio feedback is something that was highly recommended by various other experts, including my recent interview with who was it? Kevin Gannon or Jesse Stonewall? I don't remember. One of these big experts in the field for the podcast. And they were like, that's one of my favorite new things that the LMSs let you do that, we find to be highly impactful practice. Another thing is just to have them do something. They have to do something with the feedback. It's actionable feedback. It's not just theoretical. It would have been nice if you'd done this, but that's the next step in the assignment is to take the feedback and make another iteration or do something with it, or in some way
for that assignment as opposed to the next assignment, which is what I hoped they were doing, but they weren't.
Yeah, exactly. So a couple, I wanted to, one thing that a technique or strategy they bring in based on their understanding of constructivism is this idea of a preflection. So it's basically a reflection about the topic. Before we get into any of the content, they put it at the very beginning of the chapter, beginning of chapter 2, and they're like, we're going to do a preflection, and they call this an activation technique. So it helps learners kind of anticipate, prepare for learning by activating held knowledge and thinking about, priming them to go deeper by activating what they already know about it. So I think that's a pretty cool technique. And their preflection question for chapter 2, which we're discussing, is, would you consider teaching as an art, a science, neither, both? Why? So what do y'all think? Teaching as an art, as a science, neither, both? Why?
I would say both. Could be depending on the subject. I think, like Jen was saying earlier, when you learn something, there is the physical connection in the brain that activates. You're like, okay, this created something. I think on art, it depends on the way everybody learns something different, right? Like every brain is different in the physical aspect. Everyone's understanding information different ways. So that would be the art, because every person see art differently. Everyone learn differently. So science will be the way our brains connected to learn that, and the art would be, for me, would be how the students understand that material. So in my opinion, it will be both science and the art.
Nice. Love it. Yeah. What do you other folks think about this? Art, science, both, neither? How so?
Well, the science part of it, I also see as, Lawrence, to add on to yours, was sort of the iterative, the scientific method, right? This worked, they learned it, they responded, they whatever, and nope, they didn't get it, so I'm going to try something else, or I'm going to shift it, or something. So I think that's where I see this sort of science of it. The art, and I don't know whether this is exactly art, but I think there's a certain level of personal connection that has to happen in a way. Maybe the personal impacts the science of our bodies and, you know, our willingness to listen and all of being open or whatever. But I think there's a certain art or relationship building, and that's where I'd put the sort of the artsy feeling part of the role of teaching that is a little bit different than the science of, you know, assessment iteration kind of thing. But just to add on to what you said.
Yeah, I would agree with both of you. I used to, in a past life, I used to be in charge of a very large hundreds of associate faculty or adjunct faculty, and we would hold, conversations and professional development. And I would regularly refer to it as the art and craft of teaching. And in my mind, the craft is like a trade, and it is very much like a science. So I would definitely say it's both. I see the classroom as being like a laboratory, and that the instructor is constantly experimenting and hypothesizing what the best strategy and what the best technique is for delivering instruction on content. I would agree that the art component of it is very much about relationships, but I also think that when I watch teachers teach, when I'm evaluating or when I'm just visiting a classroom, there's a show to it, a theatrics. There's something that's designed to draw the student in and to kind of share that passion about your subject area. And everyone has a different element to what they bring from their personality into that show. And you can tell there are a lot of different ways to be amazing as an instructor. And, that's probably one of my favorite parts about visiting classrooms is seeing all the different ways you can be amazing at teaching the same thing. There isn't one perfect way. It's more about that relationship and that show and where you are in that scientific journey for how you're delivering it to that class. And I think those at the very, very top of their game modify the show based on the specific student audience they have that year, that day, that class, that time. And it's not just, it's not a Broadway show where it's the same show every time you do it. It's adapted and adjusted to the specific group of students you have in the room at the time. And, that's probably when you're really at the top of that art, craft, science kind of game.
And then, of course, all the visuals that you use.
Yes.
Yeah, or the demonstrations. I was just in the chemistry lab and we melted pennies with acid. I mean, that was exciting. I was really into that. I'm not going to forget that, I just want to, I'm Betsy, since you joined right after I put the link in the chat to this collaborative notes document, which has a bunch of quotes from the book and some takeaways, and feel free to add yours. So something I really enjoyed, and because Betsy, you were talking about the how you could see 4 different sub-professors teaching the same thing in such different ways, and they're all really good, but it's so different. How do they do that? So there's something they bring up in the book called the Teaching Perspectives Inventory, and it's a way that teachers can kind of understand like what's their preferred way of teaching from, what are their core values, and then bring in something else. They're like, oh, okay, that's how I usually teach, and here's some other strategies, other ways, and if I can bring in an element of that, then maybe I'll reach more students in a different way. So page 15 there, it kind of details them, but I'll it's kind of a longer topic, so I think we'll leave that for another time. But one of a quote that I really liked from the book, was, let me see if I can find it in the collaborative notes. Basically, it was, from page 16. Actually, let me share the screen in case folks are watching this recording. So we have taken more risks in our courses and challenged ourselves to design courses for our students rather than for younger versions of ourselves. And this is a really common thing that all teachers do, is that, you know, they are inevitably designing their course for what they think a student would like, and their basic model, fundamental model for what a student would like is what they would like. It makes a lot of sense, right? Like, treat your neighbor as you'd like to be treated. But it turns out not everybody wants to be treated the same, or, is going to thrive in the same type of classroom environment. So, figuring out who you are as a teacher, what your preferences are, and then being like, what else is possible? What other styles are out there? How could I bring in some of those other techniques, strategies, or orientations to teaching and learning, is just going to provide opportunities for success for more students and be more equitable for teaching. So that was just one thing I wanted to bring in, and then I thought I would ask this as the next question. So one thing I really like about this book. Sorry, yeah, please. Sure.
Taking more risk. That's a very interesting phrase in there. I mean, I'm curious. How, would everybody think that they're doing something risky or taking a risk? And how does that concept of taking a risk impact how you, let's say Josh, would interact with a faculty member to encourage them maybe to take what they quoted as a risk?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I'd love to hear from the other folks as well, but my initial thought about taking a risk is basically doing something untested, something that is we don't know, we haven't done before, the unknown. I'm going to try this new exercise, activity, case study, active learning strategy, whatever it is with the class. I've never done it before, don't know how it's going to go. Is it going to flop? Are people not going to get it? Are they going to not get engaged? Or is it going to be a huge success? And that feels a little bit risky. Now, there's also a risk to inaction, to doing the same thing the same way you've always done it. So at some point, you have to try something new and have a new result and learn from it. But I think what they were saying was learning about the science of all of this, in addition to the art of like, oh yeah, there is these different styles and different ways and different strategies, and it's good. It actually is good for me to try a different one. It'll enhance my teaching practice. It'll be better for the learners. That gives me more kind of agency or kind of motivation to take that risk and try something new in the classroom. But yeah, what do you think, Lorenz or Betsy?
So, Susanna and I have had this conversation in the past when you asked me, how do we promote lifelong learners? And I think taking risks in a classroom and being very overt and transparent about it is part of promoting that concept of lifelong learning, because at the time we talked about the fact that part of promoting lifelong learning in our students is modeling it. And when we take risks in a classroom, but we are transparent about it with our students. So everyone, today is a day when we're going to try something that I have never done before. And I've been thinking about it, and I think this is the right group of people to try it with me. This is what we're going to do. And then I'm going to need you to give me some feedback on how it worked for you so that I can learn from the experience. Now I've not only taken a risk, I've asked my students to learn how to take risks safely with me, but then I've also shown them what it means to be a lifelong learner by trying new things that may or may not succeed, collecting feedback and being open to feedback, because feedback helps us grow. We know our students don't learn from doing exercises, they learn from getting feedback. And if we show them that we learn from feedback also, then we've modeled what that looks like as a fully grown adult in a professional space, that we still have opportunities and that we should pursue learning actively and we become constructors of our own learning opportunities by creating spaces and time for us to learn, even though it hasn't been artificially created, because we're not necessarily enrolled in a class. We're doing it in our own professional space, and we're creating our own learning opportunities, and we're modeling it, and we're trying and taking risks with them.
Definitely. I want to reinforce a couple of things you said. So, you said, there's this classic quote that's attributed to John Dewey that we don't learn just from experience, we learn by reflecting on that experience. So you're inviting them into a metacognitive process in that and being like, what did we do? Why did we do it? What worked? What didn't work? So you're teaching them metacognitive skills and strategies as well, teaching them to be lifelong learners, to think critically, to examine and, ask these questions. What could be better? Why did we do this? And also you're being transparent. So this whole concept of tilt or transparency in learning and teaching will come up later in the book, but it's just another core concept in kind of teaching in higher ed that's come up in the last decade of, oftentimes that type of why, the why we're doing things or what we're doing stays in the brain of the professor. And it's a lot more effective when that's communicated to students and students are let in on the process and let in on the why and the how and the what is expected. And it just promotes more equitable success in a lot of ways. So just wanted to build on that. But yeah, Lawrence, what did you want to add?
I think I would say also, at your point, Betsy, it's telling the students it's okay to try something that may not work. But sometimes most students may not want to do something because they for the failure and so just saying, hey, we're gonna try this. It may or it may not work. Give student the incentive. Okay, I will try this. Kind of on the safety of the classroom. And I think the other thing is understand, talking about risk is, there's a quote that says insanity is doing the same thing over and expecting different results. So it's like, if to learn something, do that's going to be more effective, you're going to have to try something you don't know before. And that's scary. And like you were saying, adding the students to the process, say, hey, we're going to try something we never done before. I've never done it before. It may work, it may not, but at least you understand. And also that's part of learning. The learning is something you didn't know before, adding something else and create something different, right? That's part of that. It's like all this also create being part of learning as well. And it's I think taking risks is understanding that not everything will work, but it's okay. I think the best part is did you learn something from that, and how can I be better for next time we try it? What I'm gonna avoid. So I think that's what I would add.
So
Fantastic.
is that an approach you'd use, Lorenz or Betsy or Josh, with a faculty member who's trying to figure out how to be risky or transparent in learning? What strategies, to encourage somebody? I think we've done it for students, but is it the same or is it different for faculty?
I think one of the things that I've gotten feedback from faculty in the past is that they really, I think faculty, generally speaking, believe that everything they do is meaningful and valuable, and that they really do believe that they're delivering to the best of their abilities. So if they're not trying new things, it might actually be because they don't have ideas on what to try new. And so we set up an opportunity for instructors to share their ideas, and it kind of created a think tank or a base for creating like experiments. Oh, I could try that too. Or, oh, I can't do that, but that makes me think I might be able to try this. And it kind of it feeds that flame of ideas. And it gives them, so if they're not trying new things, it might not be because they're afraid of it. They might feel like they're at the bottom of their barrel for new things, and that they might need kind of a thought partnership or a think tank or an idea exchange platform where they can talk to their colleagues about the things their colleagues are trying, and it can kind of spur on that thought process. The other thing that I wanted to piggyback on what Lorenz was saying was, I went to a conference, and it was a STEM conference, and there was a panel of students that presented to us during lunch. And the students communicated something that really kind of hit me very hard, that they find their professors in general, these students came from all different places, to be intimidating, that they saw their instructors as being fully cooked, very much on a pedestal, One student said that she and the girls on her floor in her dorm had a pact that before an exam in a chemistry class, they would get together and collect all the questions they could and try to answer them for each other in order to avoid having to go for extra help, because they didn't want to have to go to that extra help session or ask the professor because they were so intimidated by that instructor. And I think showing our students that we are not fully cooked and that we are open to experimenting and we are still learning helps with that perception of taking us down off that pedestal and making us more approachable and more human to our students. And so, there's kind of a side benefit to being vulnerable and experimenting and being transparent with our students in the classroom, is that they start to see us as being more human and more approachable.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So there's a whole thing out there called pedagogies of failure, which is exactly this. And you can Google it. And there's just a lot of people trying things and doing research on it of like how sharing stories of failure, et cetera, helps make students feel more comfortable. So that's one thing to build on. With the other thing that Betsy was saying, or talking about communities of practice. So there's a lot of research in the scholarship of teaching and learning into the impact of getting, as you said, faculty together, who even from across disciplines to share ideas, strategies, bounce around, and get refreshed in terms of that. We at the Teaching and Learning Collaborative are very excited about that. Since COVID, it's been hard to pull people together. There's been a lot of factors influencing that. If any of you want to have that happen, please, I would love to be a partner in that initiative. We tried to do it before around case study teaching in particular, and there was interest, but it just didn't quite coalesce. So they could be communities of practice around certain topics. They could be around other things, but that's something that is very much supported in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning that we would be happy to facilitate. The other thing is instructional coaching, which is something I already do and really love doing. I do it particularly with the new faculty, but I can do it with anyone. And you were asking about that question of how do you get them to, so one way is
how do you get faculty, you mean?
Yeah. So I'll be talking to them one-on-one and I'll be like, oh, so why did you make this choice? Why are you thinking that? Why this, whatever? And then they'll be like, oh, well, it's because of this, that, and the other. And I'm like, that's so well thought out. Do you think your students know that? And more often they're like, no. And I'm like, what if they did? What would that do? And they're like, sure, I think it'd be good. It'd be great if my students knew why and how and whatever. And I'm like, cool, try it and let me know how it goes. And inevitably they're like, oh yeah, that was great. Thanks. I'm really glad I let students in on my thought process and on what we were doing and why. It only benefited everyone. And I was just like, great. So, I mean, that's more of a coaching tactic where you're just kind of asking questions and leading them to come up with their own answers, which is, usually that would be a great thing to try. So that's another thing that we offer, just more one-on-one. So we're reaching our time. So I wanted to just, I know not everybody got a chance to look as deeply at the book as you wanted to. I just wanted to introduce the anchor concepts of the book. So chapter 2 is introducing these anchor concepts. They'll reflect throughout the book. So one is equity. They go into it really in depth. I just wrote out some of the things that I thought were key to that. And anchor concept 2 is construct and connect. So we've talked a lot about constructivism and connectivism already. Anchor concept 3 is active learning and motivation, theories of motivation and active learning, how they intersect. And then the authors go more deeply into all of these. So that's kind of the basis of this, but I wanted to give you a little quick case study at the very end. So they give all these great examples. So here's an example and a scenario, and I'd love us to apply those concepts because I'm sure all of you already have a lot of held knowledge about these concepts. So there's this professor, right? His name's Aaron, and he notices that his evaluation system doesn't seem to be motivating students to earn high grades. Somehow there's a disconnect between the way he's structuring his class and the way he would like students to interact with it and the way they actually are. So the way it's structured is 25% of the grade is for individual homework assignments, and 75% of the grade is divided between 3 individual in-class exams. That's it. And he's noticed that some students do really well on the homework, but really poorly on the exams. Some students do really poorly on the homework, but really well on the exams. Some students don't do very well on both. Some students on either. And some of the things that he's like tried to make a point of in class, nobody seems to be remembering. And he's like, what's going on? So using these theories that we, I'm sure you all know a bunch about already, about theories of motivation, but also constructivism. What could he do systematically? What suggestions would you have for Aaron that he could reimagine how he is assessing students, the structure of his course, or how assessment works to better serve student success, essentially? What ideas would you suggest for Aaron?
So it was homeworks and exams were the
5% individual homework, 75% individual exams. That's how he's assessing his students. And they're just not that into it. Some students aren't doing well. The ones who are, it's kind of pro forma. What could be done to rethink the way he's assessing, to bring in more student engagement, motivation, success, from what we've talked about already with constructivism, connectivism, theories of motivation that we all have kind of brought forth from our engagement with students in the past? Any ideas off the bat?
I have so many questions.
More questions
Than I do answers, in a lot of ways, because, well, first, it really depends on what assessments is he using. They may not be valuable or connected to the material the way he thinks they are. So it might be that it's not that they're not performing well, it's that he's assessing the wrong things. Or it could be, that it's a public speaking class and he's giving exams. We need authentic assessment at that point. We want to assess in an authentic and meaningful way that resonates with the students, so that we aren't assessing for the sake of assessing. We aren't producing grades for the sake of producing grades. The grade is a byproduct of a meaningful learning experience. And if the focus is less on assessment and more on the meaningfulness of what's happening in the classroom, the grades and the assessments just kind of are a sidebar, and they are a reflection of the meaningfulness of what's happening in the classroom and how the students are engaging with the material. So if our students aren't going to be motivated by grades per se. They should be motivated by the learning experience, and the grades kind of come after the fact. And I think that's different than maybe the way it used to be decades ago. But we're becoming more and more authentic in our classrooms, and I think that the authenticity of what's happening is probably the first place I would look.
Love it. Love it. Any other initial thoughts from Susanna or Lorenz?
Yeah, probably the same thing. Because the question is there transparency to begin with? Does the students know this is what the professor is assessing? I think a quick anecdote. I had a class, a philosophy class. I loved the professor. He was really good at teaching, but he only had like 2 exams for the whole semester. And a lot of us didn't really do enjoy the class and love to learn from him. I think a lot of us didn't pass the first exam. It's not really because we didn't learn and didn't like the classes. And like you were saying, Betsy, the question seems to be what we thought was going to be in the class wasn't. And a lot of us really struggle at that. So I think having that, what he did was great. He ended up adding in the exams that helped us, so we failed the class. I think just having that transparency, is it, what do we want the student to learn? Is it connected to the question that's being asked? And like I said, if the student's not motivated about the grades, and he has to be learning, but is the professor making the learning, interesting, or not make the students at least have a way to be interested for the students. Like I was saying, that's where the art came from, right? A student may not be interested in the subject, but the professor is so passionate about it. It's just a certain way that the student becomes interested. right? So I think that would be the question is there transparency in the beginning? As soon as it's aware of the process that's happening. If not, then, professor going one way, students going another way. And we spoke.
Susanna, do you have any
I
thoughts
was
you want
just
to
that, and I'm gonna sneak off before to get my lunch. The other thing I was distracted by, the random frantic emails and texts, but would be to have the students work in groups to do the homework.
So the authors bring in a few of their concepts. One of them, as you said, they noted, oh, everything's individual. We know social constructivism so powerful. Why not have some group work? We noticed that everything is, high stakes. What about a continuum of assessment where there's lower stakes things that are happening throughout, where students have opportunity to, it's only a one-time thing. You get this assessment once, that's it. What about a thing where students can have the opportunity to, revise it, do better, that type of thing? And then autonomy. Are there any opportunities for students to make any choices about how they show what they know, or, as Betsy said, authentic assessment, relating it to something that matters to them? So all of these are in this fantastic chapter, which also suggests that those of us who engage with the chapter make a concept map at the end of what we think, how they all these ideas relate, the core concepts of the book. So another active learning strategy that you're invited to see how you'd like to use in your own classes or with this material. Really hope you'll join us at the next meeting in, I think, a few weeks from now. I'll definitely send an email out to the group. You'll all be added to the group. And definitely, whenever you get a chance, feel free to take a look at the book. I think it's a real gem, and I'm sure you'll get a lot out of it, and look forward to continuing the conversation in a couple of weeks. Thanks for joining us.
Nice to see you all.
Nice to see you. Bye.